On November 3rd, 1887, dawn came late to Coldwater and Wyoming Territory, and what little light touched the settlement showed a narrow street of plank fronts and stovepipes, bent by years of wind rising above the North Platte like a line of worn teeth. The air measured 19 degrees by the mercury tube nailed outside the post office door, and the river carried its first skin of ice upstream in ragged plates that clicked against one another like crockery in a wagon. Coldwater counted 318 souls that autumn, and nearly all of them had built their confidence on the same habit. Buy dry fuel, stack it high, trust the season to behave as it had before. 17-year-old Dustin Caldwell worked outside that habit, lifting fresh-cut cottonwood from a mule sled and setting it in careful tiers behind a half-buried stone shed at the north edge of town, where the bluff broke the worst of the crosswind. He worked with the patient economy of someone trained not by books but by weather, broad hands wrapped in old wool, sleeves dark at the cuffs from wet bark, his movements measured so no labor had to be repeated. Neighbors passing toward the store watched steam rise from the green rounds and shook their heads, because unseasoned wood in November was, in their judgment, the same as no wood at all. The common rule had been spoken for years in every yard and stable. Wet timber hissed, smoked, and wasted heat. Yet Dustin had inherited a harder rule from a colder country, and that inheritance had not come as sentiment. It had come as instruction. His father, Ira Caldwell, had crossed northern timber camps in youth with Finnish crews who cut and hauled through winters that turned breath to crystals, and from them he learned methods that treated moisture not as ruin, but as a problem to be moved, staged, and defeated. Ira had carried that craft south and west, then taught it to his son in creek bottoms, in snow pits, and by dim lantern on nights when wind rattled cabin chinking. He died the previous March when thaw rot undermined a creek bank near Willow Draw, and the edge gave way under his horse, pitching both into a melt-swollen run that broke ice and current over them before help could reach the ford. Dustin and two neighbors recovered the body by noon, and by dusk the boy had already begun sorting his father's tools into keep, mend, and trade, because grief on the frontier did not excuse neglect of weather. The chain of knowledge ran plain in his speech when asked. Finnish camp masters had taught Ira Caldwell. Ira had taught Dustin. Dustin would either prove the teaching worthy or watch it fail with him. There was no fourth possibility. He lived then in a low dwelling partly cut into the slope beyond the last fenced lot, ground many in Coldwater had called poor, because spring runoff crossed it, and because no respectable storefront could stand there without deep pilings. For Dustin, poor land meant useful earth. He and his father had started a dugout annex 2 years earlier, then expanded it after Ira's death with a practical goal: stable heat storage, smoke control, and a place where fuel could be conditioned before burning. By the first week of November, he had set his accounts in order and purchased 16 cords of unseasoned cottonwood and willow at $1.60 per cord from a river cutter eager to clear his bank lot before freeze. The same volume seasoned and split would have cost him at least $3.40 per cord, money he did not have and did not trust to market mercy. The method was plain to anyone willing to stand still and look. Dustin built a 2-flue masonry stove from fieldstone, fire brick and lime mortar mixed 3 parts sand to 1 part lime with horsehair binder. The firebox throat narrowed to force hotter draft through the lower run before it bent upward into a drying gallery. He laid the lower flue long and shallow, then brought the second channel through a vertical chase behind slatted shelves 12 feet from end to end and 4 tiers high, each tier spaced 6 inches to allow moving air around wrist-thick billets. Fresh wood did not go to flame. It went first to movement. Damp surfaces gave up water in the warm current. Moisture climbed, and only then did billets rotate to the burn stack. It was not quick, but it was dependable. Behind the stoveroom, he cut farther into the slope and packed the annex walls to 30 inches of earth and clay. Tamped in lifts, faced inside with rough plank and a thin wash of lime to hold dust down, the floor sat lower than the threshold by 14 inches, enough to trap heavier cold near the entry, while inhabited space remained steadier. On still mornings, the annex held near 55 degrees, while outside frost formed white ridges on hitching rails. He set 2 intake vents with shutter boards, one low for combustion air and one high to bleed excess smoke, and he marked each vent position with notches so adjustments could be repeated exactly instead of guessed. Ezekiel Harrow, general store owner, trustee, and the richest merchant on the street, showed little patience for what he could not sell across a counter. He was a broad man in his middle years, heavy through the chest, beard trimmed square, broadcloth coat cut in Cheyenne, boots polished even on muddy days, and a gold watch chain that crossed his vest like a statement of rank. His storeroom held flour, lamp wicks, nails, coal allotments, and nearly every household account in Coldwater, either by coin or by debt, and he spoke with the easy certainty of a man used to having the last word. The first time he saw Dustin stacking wet wood under canvas beside the shed, he laughed in front of 3 teamsters and called the site Caldwell Smokehouse Folly, drawing the word folly out long enough for the men to repeat it later at the watering trough and church walk. The name spread quickly because mockery required less effort than understanding. Women coming from the pump said the orphan was burning money into the sky. Ranch hands said he was cooking logs instead of homes. Older men at the hitch rail remarked that any boy who trusted green cottonwood in Wyoming winter would be begging kindling by Christmas. Dustin answered none of them with argument. He kept to his sequence, loading the lower shelf with fresh splits at dawn, shifting yesterday's wood to the middle racks by noon, then tapping billets with the back of his knife in the evening to hear the pitch change from dull thud to sharp ring. That ring, not color, guided burn order. On November 9th, after 3 nights below 15 degrees, he made a public demonstration without naming it as such. He carried 2 equal bundles to the open patch near Harrow's loading platform, one drawn directly from an uncovered green pile, and one drawn from his upper shelf after 36 hours in gallery heat. He invited no crowd, yet a crowd formed. The green bundles smoked thick, spat sap, and took more than 9 minutes to establish flame in an iron basket. The gallery bundle took in less than 2 minutes and burned with an even yellow body and little visible smoke. Harrow watched from his doorway and called it a trick of kindling size. Dustin set both bundles side by side on the planks for inspection and returned to work without a word. By mid-November, the routine had become a machine built of hands, timing, and measured heat. He recorded exterior and interior temperatures each morning and sundown in a deer-hide ledger stitched by his father, noted vent positions, wood species, and drying duration, and adjusted his rotations by weather. Cottonwood near bark dried slower than split willow hearts. Billets cut to wrist thickness performed better than thicker rounds in rapid cold drops. Smoke stayed low when lower flue draft held steady and upper vent remained half open for the first hour after loading. These were not theories to him. They were repeated outcomes. Coldwater still trusted abundance more than method. Coal sat in bins. Kerosene tins stood full in the store. Wagon talk said the rail was running fair, and winter would be ordinary if luck held. Yet, even before the month turned, geese crossed south in a low black wedge, weeks ahead of custom. Beaver along the river had raised mud and stick walls higher than old trappers remembered, and a hard, pale ring circled the moon night after night over the bluff. Dustin noticed each sign and widened his stacking lanes, So snow, if it came hard, would not trap access to the driest tiers. From Harrow's porch, watching the boy move one more load of wet willow into ordered rows, the merchant told his customers that some failures announced themselves early, and that Coldwater was fortunate enough to witness one in plain view. The men on Harrow's porch answered with dutiful laughter, though two of them glanced past him toward the half-buried shed and watched Dustin take a last armload inside before dusk. The wind had turned east and carried a damp edge from the river, and by lantern light the boy checked each vent notch, then marked in his deer-hide ledger, lower flue strong, upper draft moderate, shelf 1 newly loaded, shelf 4 ready for burn. He closed the book, set a stone on its cover against curling, and banked the fire for the night with billets no thicker than his wrist. In Coldwater, routine still looked like safety. By dawn, routine began to break. On November 21st, 1887, at 11 minutes past 10, the telegraph key in the post office struck so fast that Postmaster Eli Boone called his daughter from the back room to copy numbers. A bridge washout east of Medicine Bow had torn pilings from the channel and dropped 2 spans into black water. Coal cars were halted. Flour wagons were turned back. Repair estimates ran to 5 weeks if weather held, longer if it did not. By noon, the message had crossed all 318 souls in Coldwater, and by 1 o'clock a line stood at Ezekiel Harrow's counter, 4 households deep, each family calculating how much fuel and lamp oil stood between them and January. Harrow moved through that line with a pencil behind his ear and a ledger open under his palm, and by late afternoon he had changed his rates in ink that pressed hard enough to mark 3 pages below. Coal from $11 to $19 per ton, kerosene up nearly half, flour by the sack raised in smaller steps to avoid panic all at once. He named freight uncertainty, replacement risk, and trustee duty to preserve stock, then took payment in coin first and credit only at terms that favored his books. Several buyers protested, but they paid. No one else in town had coal in bulk. No one else held the kerosene tins. When Dustin came in for salt, 2 pounds at 7 cents, Harrow held the scoop midair and spoke loud enough for the line behind him to hear. He said hunger would not teach science to a boy reared among wolves, and he asked whether the orphan meant to season timber with prayer, now that rails had failed. Dustin laid exact coin on the counter, waited for his packet, and answered in a voice level enough to calm a skittish mule. I season wood with time, moving air, and measured heat. You may call that what you like. He turned, nodded once to Eli Boone near the door, and walked home before full dark. A deceptive warmth arrived the next day, then held through the day after, noon mercury touching 46 degrees under a pale sky so still that smoke rose straight from every chimney on the street. Families opened shed doors, counted stacks, and told one another the break-in, weather-proved winter would stagger rather than strike. Children kicked thawed mud from boot heels. Men delayed second purchases from Harrow. Church talk shifted from shortage to patience. Dustin altered nothing of consequence. He split fresh willow to uniform thickness, never more than 3 inches across, and fed the lower gallery in shorter intervals so moisture would lift without chilling the flue run. He broke through old clay at the annex wall and added a second intake tunnel, 22 feet from mouth to chamber, lined with scavenged stone, and pitched a finger-width downhill for condensate drain. By the time that brief softness ended and night dropped below 10 degrees again, the town had burned through a costly share of its seasoned piles. Dustin had converted a new rotation, stacking by chalk mark and day count, fresh to shelf 1, half dry to shelf 2, wringing dry to shelf 4, each tier separated by slats cut to 3/4 inch, so airflow stayed constant. On December 3rd, with dawn at -4 and blowing powder over the bluff, He measured annex interior at 54 degrees and wrote the number beside vent positions and wood species. The method remained plain. Coldwater still mistrusted what it did not practice. Harrow then carried ridicule into policy. At the first trustee board meeting after the bridge report, held by lamplight in the rear room of the church, he argued that smoke from Caldwell's place constituted nuisance and hazard and should be fined at $2 per day until corrected. Two trustees agreed in principle. One, blacksmith Nolan Pike, asked for proof that smoke rose worse than any other stove in town. Harrow replied that disorder itself was proof enough, that improvised systems invited catastrophe. Word of the threatened fine reached Dustin before sunrise through Ruth Vale's father, who clerked 2 days each week at the post office and still believed fact should precede punishment. Dustin did not petition and did not plead. He prepared a demonstration for the following afternoon in the open lot by the pump, where any soul could witness without accusation of secrecy. He brought 3 bundles, each weighed on Boone's grain scale to the same pound. Raw cottonwood from open stack, partially dried cottonwood from shelf 2, and fully conditioned willow from shelf 4. He set identical iron braziers, equal kindling beneath, and at Eli Boone's signal lit all 3 with one taper split into 3 points. The first bundle hissed and thickened the air. The second smoked, then steadied. The third caught clean, burned bright, and sent almost no visible plume once established. Dustin then struck 2 billets on stone. One answered dull. One rang sharp as a mallet on rail. He said no more than 12 words to the circle around him. Wet fuel belongs in transit, not in the firebox. The trustees withdrew the nuisance warning without public apology. Harrow called the display theater and told ranch hands at his counter that Caldwell was cooking logs instead of homes. That spectacle did not warm children through a true storm. The phrase spread faster than the earlier nickname because it gave idle men something to repeat while stomping snow from boots. At church steps the following Sunday, women who had traded eggs for kindling in October passed Dustin without greeting. A boy from the south lots mimed coughing when Dustin walked by with a sled of split willow. The exclusion settled broad and quiet, social rather than shouted and therefore harder to answer. Dustin answered it with labor. By the second week of December, his records filled 6 more pages. He noted geese crossing south 3 weeks early in a low, unbroken wedge that did not circle the river flats. He noted beaver dams upstream built higher than any mark his father had sketched in prior winters. Mud shoulder raised almost to willow crotch on the east bank. He noted a hard halo around the moon. 4 straight nights. Ring sharp-edged and pale as ground bone. A sign Ira Caldwell had always treated as warning of ice-laden air. When asked at the pump what he made of it, Dustin said simply that weather had begun to gather weight and that weight eventually fell. Coldwater did not wholly ignore him, but it translated his warning into folklore and filed it with other frontier sayings that cost nothing to hear and less to heed. Harrow sold another quarter-ton allotments at the raised rate. Families bought what they could and promised themselves thrift would bridge the gap to repaired rails. The doctor, Alvin Price, urged households to seal window seams with cloth and tallow. Yet even he admitted he had no answer if fuel failed in sustained cold. Snow came in brief skins, then blew clear. The pauses looked like mercy. They were only pauses. On December 18th, sunset reached -7 degrees, and Dustin made final alterations to the annex as if he were preparing a public hall rather than a private shelter. He widened both earth-backed benches to 20 inches, long enough to seat 40 adults shoulder to shoulder if need demanded. He set iron hooks above the main stove arch for 3 soup kettles and 1 washpot, each hook forged from salvaged wagon tire and tested under doubled load. He drove pegs by the door for mittens and scarves. laid straw mats near the entry trench to keep melt from pooling, and stacked spare wool blankets in oilcloth wraps labeled by size with charcoal marks. Most consequential, he tied a rope line from his annex door to the well path and then onward toward the church corner. Knots every 8 feet so frozen hands could count distance in whiteout when sight failed. He sank each post deeper than usual, 30 inches where 20 would have sufficed in fair weather, and braced corners with cross stakes to resist drift pressure. Ruth Vale watched him knot the final span and asked whether he truly believed souls would need a line merely to cross town. He looked down the street where stove smoke lay flat under a lowering sky and gave her the same calm sentence he had once given his father's horse during a river crossing. Gone rough. Let them talk. Words do not keep out the wind. Night fell early, and the temperature dropped in stepped intervals that could be felt through plank walls before it could be read on glass. Harrow closed his shutters and counted remaining coal by lamplight, confident that inventory and authority were near enough to the same thing. In the Caldwell Annex, lower flue heat moved upward through damp timber, and the upper shelves gave back dry billets one rotation at a time. Outside, the street went still except for the river's distant grind under forming ice. Inside, Dustin entered one more line in the deer-hide ledger, sanded the ink, and placed the book beside the door where he could reach it in the dark. A little after midnight, the wind pressed hard against the annex door, then dropped so quickly that the stove draft changed pitch, and Dustin rose from his cot without lighting a lamp, found the vent notches by touch, and narrowed the upper shutter one mark to keep the heat lane steady through the shelves. He moved among stacked billets with the practiced caution of a sawyer in dark timber, lifted 3 pieces from shelf 3, split one through the center with a short-handled maul, and inspected the pale heart for damp gleam. It showed only a thin dark crescent near the bark. He set that billet back to transit, shifted 2 drier pieces to the burn crate, and wrote the correction in the ledger while embers still glowed red at the firebox throat. By first light, the exterior tube read -9 degrees, and the annex held 53. Not warm by comfort standards, but stable by survival standards, and stability was the figure he trusted. He spent the next day extending the system beyond what Ira Caldwell had ever built, not from pride but from arithmetic. 16 cords bought in November had to bridge a town that still believed in purchased rescue, and each inefficiency now carried the weight of lives, even if no one named it aloud. He salvaged 2 wagon tongues from behind the blacksmith shed with Nolan Pike's permission, cut them to 11-foot rails, and framed a 5th shelf tier above the original gallery, bracing the uprights with iron strap offcuts traded for 1 pound of nails and a promise of spring labor. The new shelf sat closest to the upper chase where air ran hottest, so he reserved it for willow and cottonwood hearts split to 2 1/2 inches, wood that could over-dry and crumble if left too long in direct draft. He marked each row with charcoal dates on pine tags, loaded, rotated, burned. Guesswork had no place in January. 3 days passed before the next trustee rider came with a written notice folded into oilcloth, and this time the charge was not nuisance smoke but unauthorized excavation depth beyond lot line. The rider, young Caleb Rourke, looked embarrassed while reading the order, because he had watched Dustin's rope posts go in deeper than any other in town and understood why. But he read every word anyway as duty required. Dustin listened, asked for the survey stake reference, and walked the boundary with Rourke in the noon wind, measuring by chain and counting paces from the same stone corner Boone had recorded in 1884. The annex wall stood inside limit by 14 inches. Rourke wrote that fact on the back of the notice, signed it, and left with his hat pulled low. By supper, the story had reached Harrow's porch, where men said the orphan had slipped trouble this time, by inches only. and that inches would not save him from weather. Dustin answered pressure by improving process. He cut a condensation sump at the base of the second intake tunnel, 1 cubit deep and lined with flat shale, so moisture dropping from warming air would not pool in the channel and freeze. He fitted a removable grate over the sump from bent stove wire, easy to clear with a hooked stick. He reshaped the lower flue baffle with fresh clay and brick shards to lengthen gas travel before the turn, gaining more heat transfer to the drying run and less soot in the upper bend. On December 20th, he ran a controlled test with identical billets, one direct from outside stack and one cycled 48 hours through shelf 4 and then 24 through shelf 5. The outside piece smoked for 11 minutes before sustaining flame. The cycled piece established in 90 seconds and left ash fine enough to blow from the shovel. He entered both results beside temperature readings and fuel weight. The method tightened. Cold water did not reward the improvement with curiosity. It escalated ridicule into custom. At Harrow's store counter, where credit books decided who ate and who waited, the merchant began using Caldwell's Smokehouse Folly, not as a joke but as shorthand for incompetence in all matters. A cracked lantern globe became Folly Glass. A spoiled sack of cornmeal became Folly Meal. The phrase carried into barns and church paths until children repeated it without knowing its origin. On the Sunday before Christmas, when snow drifted in thin streamers along the plank walk, 2 ranch hands tied a bundle of green brush to Dustin's hitch rail and said, loud enough for those exiting service, that he now had proper supper for his stove. No one laughed openly in front of him. No one removed the brush either. He untied it, cut it down, and set it on a shelf 1. Ruth Vale saw more than most adults admitted. She began crossing to the annex after her morning chores, first with a pail of well water, and then with questions too precise to ignore. Why did one stack get bark side down while another stood bark side out? Why did he rotate willow faster than cottonwood? Why did he keep the bench nearest the door clear, though it was the coldest seat in the room? Dustin answered each question as if she were an apprentice, because in truth she was becoming one. Bark side down on lower shelves, she'd drip where sweep-up was easiest. Willow lost moisture quickly, but also checked and split, so it needed shorter heat. The cold bench stayed open for arrival triage, where frozen hands could be worked before deeper seating. Ruth repeated his answers at home. Her mother told neighbors. By evening, Harrow had heard that the orphan was teaching children furnace tricks, and he called it dangerous vanity from a boy who had not yet reached voting age. On December the 22nd, Harrow attempted a harder measure. He proposed at the church rear room that any household using Caldwell's annex as a common shelter would forfeit store credit until spring settlement, citing liability and contagion risk from crowding. The room went still. Dr. Alvin Price, who rarely opposed Harrow in public matters, objected in plain terms. He said cold killed faster than close air, and that no trustee should punish preparation while supply lines remained severed. Nolan Pike supported him, adding that Harrow had sold nearly all dry coal already, and had no right to condemn alternatives he could not replace. The proposal failed by 1 vote, yet the debate itself deepened division. By the next morning, some households avoided Dustin from fear of being seen near him, while others began sending small trades after dark. Rendered fat, 2 turnips, a half sack of barley, all offered with quick hands and no conversation. By the 4th week of December, warning signs gathered in layers no seasoned frontier eye could miss. Horses in the south lots turned hindquarters to the north, even at feeding, tails tight, standing in a line against wind that had not yet arrived. Crows left the cottonwoods along the river and settled inland on fence runs before noon, then flew low and silent at dusk. Frost formed not indelicate fern patterns, but in thick, opaque plates inside window corners, a sign of hard pressure shifts rather than ordinary overnight cold. On 2 successive evenings, a ring circled the moon again, broader now and crossed by faint light pillars that reached upward like pale stakes in the sky. Dustin pointed once, quietly, to Eli Boone near the pump, and said the ice in the upper air had multiplied. Boone nodded, then said perhaps it would pass north of them. Hope sounded thin in his mouth. The barometer in Dr. Price's office, a brass instrument brought west in a padded case years earlier, dropped from 29.8 to 29.1 between dawn and evening on December 23rd. Price mentioned it to 3 men at the store. Harrow replied that instruments frightened men who lacked nerve, that Wyoming always threatened and seldom delivered. He had begun sleeping in his stockroom to guard remaining fuel, and fatigue sharpened his voice to a brittle edge. Shelves once full now showed plankbacks between goods. Kerosene tins stood in a single row instead of 3. Coal in the rear bin had frozen into crusted lumps that took a pick to break. Still, he told buyers to remain calm and buy only what policy allowed. Policy was all he had left that looked like command. Dustin spent that same day laying redundancy into every task that mattered. He doubled the rope line from annex door to well path with a second strand set shoulder height, so a fallen traveler could still find hold. He tied each knot with a stopper tail long enough for mitten grip, then rubbed rendered fat into the fibers to slow ice glazing. He pre-filled 3 soup kettles with barley, onion, and salt pork trim, set lids tight, and staged them by hook number for quick rotation. He stacked kindling bundles in exact counts of 40, each bound with twine and dipped at one end in tallow for reliable start flame. He moved spare mittens to the entry pegs by size, and stitched cloth tags marked small, medium, large, child, because searching in cold wasted heat and time alike. As dusk approached, he chalked capacity marks on the annex wall at seated shoulder height, 1 mark per 10 souls, so crowding could be managed without argument when fear arrived. Late on December the 23rd, a wagon from the South Trail reached town with 1 axle split and canvas torn to ribbons. The driver, Asa Bell, reported drifts already forming in open cuts 20 miles out, though no major snow had fallen in Coldwater yet. He said the wind beyond the ridge had a knife edge, and that sky color west of Elk Draw looked wrong, too blue and too hard for ordinary weather. Harrow called it trail dramatics from a man seeking sympathy prices for damaged goods. Dustin offered Bell a hot ladle from the annex kettle and asked only one question: whether stock on the trail had begun refusing water. Bell said yes, since morning. Dustin thanked him, then added 2 more billets to shelf 5 and shortened all rotation intervals by 1 hour. Christmas Eve dawned with deceptive clarity. The sun rose sharp over crusted snow, casting long gold bars across the street, and by noon the post office thermometer climbed to 24 degrees, warmer than any soul had expected after the prior week. Children ran brief errands without scarves. Women shook rugs outside doors. Harrow stood on his porch and declared to passing customers that the worst had been sold as panic by men who profited from fear. Yet by mid-afternoon, smoke from chimneys ceased rising and began to flatten, then slide south in a single low sheet. Dogs refused the open street and scratched at barn doors. The river sound changed from rolling grind to muffled thud under thickening ice. At the Caldwell Annex, Dustin fed the lower flue with 2 measured charges, checked both intake tunnels, and set the ledger open to a clean page beside the door where he could reach it in the dark. By 4 o'clock, a blue wall had risen over the western ridge, not cloud in scattered ranks, but a single advancing face that erased distance as it came, and the wind that preceded it struck the street in cross-currents hard enough to rattle loose boards from hitch rails. Dustin stepped outside once, read the drift of chimney smoke flattening near ground, and returned to the stove without calling to anyone, because warning had already been given and weather had already chosen its hour. At 5:30, the post office thermometer still held 21 degrees. At 7, it read 4. At 9, it fell below 0 and kept falling as if the glass itself had become a chute. Cold water had prepared for winter in the old manor, each family by its own stack and stove, each hearth trusting that fuel quantity would compensate for uneven quality. Under that descending air mass, the flaw in that trust declared itself quickly. Damp cordwood hissed in cast-iron boxes and threw steam more than heat. Chimney draft failed in houses where flues had not been swept since October, and smoke rolled back into rooms where children and elders sat wrapped in quilts. Kerosene lamps dimmed as wicks crusted in hurried trimming. By midnight, with wind driving snow in horizontal sheets between buildings, the town no longer moved by streets but by guesswork from doorway to doorway. At the Caldwell Annex, lower flue temperature remained steady because every billet entering the fire had completed its cycle. Dustin fed the burn crate in half charges, 23 minutes apart, keeping combustion hot enough to stay clean and low enough to preserve stock. He checked the intake tunnel for rime, cleared the condensation sump twice with a bent hook, and shifted shelf rotations by species as the outside cold deepened. Willow from Tier 5 moved first, then cottonwood hearts from Tier 4. Bark-heavy pieces held for longer transit. The method held because it had been built for this exact arithmetic, not comfort, endurance. On Christmas morning, December the 25th, 1887, dawn never properly formed. The sky remained a moving white lid, and the post office reading taken under lantern at 8 o'clock registered minus 31 degrees. Wind drove fine snow through nail holes and under thresholds. A team horse broke its tie behind Harrow's store and vanished into drift before anyone could reach the alley. Church bells did not ring. The sound could not carry. By mid-morning, the first official plan failed. Trustee instructions had directed households to conserve coal by banked burns overnight and relight from embers at dawn. But many grates contained only clinkered lumps that would not catch. Harrow's rear coal bin, already frozen in crusted masses, required pick blows that exhausted men before fuel reached a stove. He opened sales for 1 hour and closed again when the line turned disorderly, then reopened at a higher ration price by sack rather than by promised weight, claiming he would settle differences once scales could be used. No one argued long in that wind. They took what they could carry and bent into the white. Near noon, Alvin Price attempted rounds to 3 houses where elders were reported weak from cold. He reached one, turned back from a drifted cut at the second, and returned to his office with ice on his beard and 1 glove missing. Nolan Pike and 2 ranch hands cut a path shoulder deep with grain shovels, then lost it within an hour as snow crossed over their trench. Rope was now the only reliable road, and only 1 full rope network had been laid before the storm, Dustin's. By the afternoon of December the 26th, after 36 hours of sustained wind, roof loads began to deform in the older cabins nearest the river, where rafters had been set light during prosperous seasons and never reinforced. A shed behind the Vale home collapsed inward under drift, crushing feed barrels and 1 axle cart. The church vestibule door froze against drift pack, trapping 6 souls inside until they dug out with stove shovels. At Harrow's store, a stovepipe joint split from uneven firing and sent sparks into the rear storeroom wall. The fire was beaten down with wet grain sacks, but 2 shelves of lamp oil and twine were ruined by smoke and steam. The merchant's authority, once broad as inventory, narrowed to his own breath and hands. 3 days passed in that white pressure before any lull worth naming arrived, and even then it came as a brief thinning of wind rather than true relief. On December the 29th, the thermometer rose to minus 18 at noon. which in ordinary winter might have meant hard work and recovery, but cold water had already burned through too much fuel to use mild language for the condition. Families tore fence rails for kindling. Chair legs disappeared from 2 kitchens on the south lots. In several homes, meals had shifted to one thin pot at dusk, and nothing warm before dawn. Inside the annex, Dustin moved from private schedule to public system. He chalked work rotations by the door and erased names as tasks changed. 2 souls on intake and tunnel clearing, 2 on splitting warmed billets, 2 on kettles, 2 on water, 2 on watch at rope entry. He placed Eli Boone on ledger tallies because the postmaster's hand remained steady even in fatigue. He put Amos Vale at the stove, where strength and patience mattered in equal measure. He taught without speech-making, one instruction at a time, each tied to observed result. If a load smoked, the vent was wrong or the wood was early. If ash darkened, combustion had fallen below clean range. If frost formed on the inner lintel, entry discipline had slipped. By December 31st, Coldwater's population under shelter shifted nightly. Some souls still remained in their homes by stubbornness or necessity, but more arrived at dusk with bundles and pails, then returned at first light to tend livestock, retrieve bedding, or check kin. No one called the annex folly now. No one needed the old word. The second assault began on January 2nd, 1888. Wind returned from the north with a force that turned drift edges hard as packed flour and drove ambient readings to -38 by dawn. On January 3rd, the post office tube checked by Boone before the spirit column stuck in the tube marked -43 degrees at first light. At that level, exposed skin failed quickly. Lamp chimneys cracked at door opening, and ordinary breathing burned the throat like smoke. The weather was no longer season. It was a weapon. Schoolteacher Lila Morrow died that morning 50 paces from the schoolhouse step. She had gone out before full light to recover attendance slates and copybooks stored in a chest near the stove, believing the paper could be burned for heat in households already out of kindling. When she did not return, 2 men followed her track line and found her seated against the step with her coat wrapped around the bundle she had gathered, gloved hands still closed around the straps. They carried both teacher and books to the church hall. The books were used that evening to start 3 cooking fires for families who had none left to light with. Her name was spoken over each kettle. On January 4th, Dr. Price received word that an infant on the east lots had fallen into hard breathing and needed warmth and broth quickly. Nolan Pike volunteered to cut trail ahead of the doctor's sled, tying a rope at his waist and taking a broad shovel and axe. He broke a passage along fence posts for nearly 300 yards before wind erased the line behind him. The doctor reached the house after noon, and the infant survived the night. But Nolan did not return with the sled team. They found him at dusk beside a drifted corner where he had driven the axe through packed crust to mark direction for those behind. His gloves were off, tucked inside his coat, likely given to the doctor when one tore at the wrist. The blacksmith who had asked for proof in church and voted against punitive nonsense died making room for another household to live. Old Marta Elling died on the 6th of January when drift load caved the rear of her cabin roof near the river bend. She had mocked smoke bread and Caldwell methods in November, loudly and often, yet she had also fed 2 widowers through autumn from her own oven and mended mittens for children without charge. Neighbors reached her door on Dustin's rope extension after hearing the collapse, but the back room had dropped too far for safe lift in that wind. She was carried to the annex wrapped in a quilt of blue squares and laid near the warm wall until burial could be done. No one in that room used mockery language again. By then, Harrow's household had entered the same arithmetic as everyone else, only later and with less practice. His purchased coal was gone. Furniture had begun to feed the parlor stove, In desperation, he loaded undried cottonwood from a frozen yard pile, overfired to force heat, and split his own chimney lining before dawn on January 7th. Sparks ran the flue, caught old Dust in the back room, and gutted the storage wall before neighbors could throw enough slush to stop it. By daylight, his ledgers were warped, his kerosene shelf blackened, and half his winter goods unusable. Broadcloth and polished boots offered no protection from that reckoning. Near midday on January 7th, with drift shoulder high along most doorways, Amos Vale came to the annex entry, pulling the outer rope with one hand and guiding Ruth behind him on the shoulder line, both wrapped in blankets over coats. Ruth's lashes were white with blown frost, but she stood upright and answered clearly when spoken to. Amos removed his hat inside the trench and said his wife's fire had died twice and would not catch from damp wood, that he had 3 children at home and 1 elderly aunt, and that pride had become a poor fuel. Ruth then asked, in a voice stripped of ceremony, for 1 bucket of established coals and whatever instruction would keep them alive through the next night. Dustin handed her the coal bucket himself, but he did not send them back alone with a wish. He assigned Eli Boone and 2 others to escort the Vales along the rope, reset their stove draft, and bring the family in at dusk if the burn failed again. Then he turned to the room and spoke loud enough for all benches to hear, each word practical and unadorned. Any household that could carry water, split billets, stir kettles, tend children, clear intake, or hold night watch had full right to space in the annex. Those unable to work would be worked for. No coin required. No account entered against them. From that hour, the shelter became organized rescue rather than improvised refuge. Tasks were posted in 2-hour blocks. Entry was managed by count marks on the wall, so air and space remained workable. Wet garments hung by size and owner peg to prevent morning confusion. Broth was thinned for volume and salted for laborers. Wood moved in strict sequence from shelf to crate to stove, never broken by panic loading. Even in exhaustion, Dustin corrected errors without anger, because 1 wrong vent setting could cost an entire room its margin by dawn. At dusk on the same day, Ezekiel Harrow appeared at the outer rope line bareheaded, beard rimed white, hands shaking so hard he could not tie off his scarf. 2 men nearest the door looked toward Dustin and waited for instruction. He gave it at once. Bring him in. Put him on warmed splits, not heavy rounds. Keep him moving until his hands recover. Harrow entered without speech, took the axe set out for him, and began splitting billets beside Nolan Pike's old chopping block. Each strike awkward at first and then steadier as heat returned to his arms. No one made him kneel. No one asked him for words while the storm still stood over the town. Through the night of January the 7th and into January 8th, the annex fire cycled cleanly. Kettles turned in order. Rope teams moved by knot count between shelters, and the room held at 52 to 55 degrees, while outside cold remained below -40. Cold water had not been spared. It had been carried. At first light on January 8th, the wind eased only enough to let rope teams hear one another at 10 paces, and Dustin used that narrow margin with the same discipline he had used for fire. He sent pairs out by knot count, never fewer than 2, each pair carrying a coal scuttle, a bundle of shelf-dried willow, and a slate card showing vent positions for weak draft, normal draft, and smoke rollback. Households that still had sound stoves were taught to rebuild heat lanes instead of feeding panic fires. Households with cracked throats or blocked chimneys were marked in Boone's hand for night transfer to the annex. Harrow worked those runs beside men who had once taken credit from him with lowered eyes. In the drift, rank had no purchase. By that evening, 26 souls slept inside the annex, and 43 more cycled through for broth, coal starts, and instruction. Dustin stood at the stove arch, and corrected technique one movement at a time. Split smaller. Do not choke the grate. Keep one dry reserve wrapped in oilcloth. Never spend the last ignition source on a single load. He placed Ruth Vale at the entry pegs with chalk and tallyboard, and she became the room's quiet order, assigning mittens, recording arrivals, and matching children to blankets without confusion. Amos Vale and Eli Boone managed intake clearing at 2-hour intervals so the tunnel would not glaze shut. The system had begun as one boy's defense against ridicule. It was now a town's working grammar for survival. 3 days later, with noon still below -20, Dustin ordered a measured drawdown of gallery stock to preserve shelf heat for the longest haul homes near the river bend. He paired Harrow with Caleb Rourke on splitting detail and made them count every billet into bins marked immediate burn, overnight reserve, and transport grade. The contrast was plain in the numbers Boone logged at the door. Dustin's entire November purchase, 16 cords at $1.60, had been stretched through rotation and conditioning into continuous usable fuel. Harrow's expensive coal and hurried damp wood had failed under stress despite higher cost, larger volume, and formal authority. No one said this aloud while the cold still bit, yet every soul in that room understood it. On January 12th, the sky finally opened in a thin blue seam over the ridge, and for 2 hours sunlight struck the upper drift faces hard enough to glaze them silver. That same afternoon they carried Lila Morrow, Nolan Pike, and Marta Elling to temporary graves cut in wind-packed ground behind the church, each wrapped and named, each burial witnessed by families who had shared their last warm wall. Dr. Price read the names without ornament and then read the work roster for the night, because mourning and labor stood side by side that winter, and neither released the other. By the 3rd week of January, telegraph repair reached Coldwater with confirmation that the Medicine bow span had been shored and limited rail movement restored. Wagons began to arrive in staggered intervals, wheels chained and axles groaning through churned snow, and new coal could be bought again by ton instead of rumor. The emergency did not end in 1 hour. It thinned by degrees. Families moved bedding back to cabins, then returned to the annex after dark for one more night, then one fewer. Dustin kept teaching even as the room emptied, walking stove to stove with Boone's slate cards, and checking draw by candle flame at each damper seam. The reckoning began before any formal meeting, in doorways and woodlots where men removed their hats and found language difficult. Some spoke directly. Some offered labor first and words later. Widow Ann Pike came with Nolan's heavy maul and asked Dustin to keep it in the annex because her husband had trusted the place when policy failed him. Dr. Price stood at the Caldwell rope post, looked at the knots with gloved fingers, and said that medicine had done less than carpentry in that storm, which wasn't a sentence he had ever expected to speak. Ruth Vale returned the entry slate cleaned and oiled, then asked for a copy of Dustin's rotation marks so she could teach them to her younger brothers by spring. The formal gathering came in late January, when roads reopened enough for all households to reach the church by daylight. Coldwater had 318 souls in November. By that meeting, 315 remained. The room was full long before the stove settled into steady draw. Harrow stood first, not because anyone invited him to lead, but because silence made delay look like cowardice, and he had no ground left to stand on except plain speech. His coat was patched at the cuff where backroom fire had scorched it, his beard thinner, his watch chain absent. He said he had named the annex Caldwell Smokehouse Folly and repeated the words without softening them. He said he had raised coal from $11 to $19 and called it duty when it had also been fear and greed. He said he had used store credit as a lever against households already cold and had attempted to punish the only system in town that turned wet fuel into usable heat at scale. He placed his trusty papers and store account books on the front table, requested public audit by Eli Boone and 2 elected witnesses, and surrendered his seat before any vote compelled him. When he finished, he did not ask to be restored. He asked to be assigned work where his hands could repay what his judgment had damaged. Others followed, not in theatrical order, but in the rough sequence of courage. Ranch hand Otis Bell admitted tying green brush to Dustin's rail and repeating cooking logs instead of homes until his own stove failed. Martha Klein, who had passed Dustin on church steps all December without greeting, said exclusion had felt polite at the time and cruel in retrospect, and that politeness had nearly cost her children heat on the second night of the storm. Caleb Rourke acknowledged reading trusty warnings he suspected were unjust, and vowed never again to confuse procedure with truth when lives depended on the distinction. Even those who could not form apology language stood and named one act they would change before next winter. Dustin listened from the side bench with his father's deer-hide ledger on his knees, hands resting on the worn cover where years of soot had darkened the stitching. He did not interrupt any speaker. When the room had emptied its prepared statements and unprepared shame alike, Boone asked whether he wished to answer the apologies directly. Dustin rose, set the ledger on the table beside Harrow's account books, and spoke in a voice that carried to the back wall without strain. He said Ira Caldwell had taught him that heat was a duty before it was a commodity, and that duty did not become optional because neighbors laughed. He said words had harmed him, and that harm would not be erased by one evening of confession. He said 3 names sat heavier than pride in that room, and that any reckoning worth keeping must be measured against Lila Morrow, Nolan Pike, and Marta Elling, not against wounded vanity. He said he would teach any household willing to practice, drying galleries 12 feet or shorter where space required, earth-backed walls not less than 24 inches, reserve stacks marked by day count, and rope lines set before first storm sign, not after first panic. Whether others called that forgiveness, he said, was not his task to settle. His task was to make sure the next hard winter found Coldwater less ignorant. No applause followed. The room stood in the quieter recognition that instruction had been offered at cost, and that receiving it would require more than gratitude. Boone recorded 4 immediate resolutions in the church book that night. A common fuel yard on town ground above floodline, winter quotas posted by household size, annual chimney inspection before November 15th, and a standing shelter roster using Caldwell methods under shared supervision. Harrow's ledgers were carried to the post office safe for audit. Dustin's ledger was copied over 6 evenings by lamplight, each vent mark and temperature note transcribed into town record in Boone's precise hand. By April, thaw exposed the full damage and the full lesson. 27 homes rebuilt stove rooms to Caldwell measurements, adapting where floor plans forced variation, but keeping core principles intact. The cooperative woodlot purchased green timber in bulk at spring rates, then cycled it through 3 communal galleries, so no household entered December with raw stacks and false confidence. Children old enough to carry kindling were taught billet grading by sound, dull for transit and sharp for burn, and they learned knot counting on rope lines before they learned card games. Harrow sold his store at a loss, cleared what debts he could without seizure, and took paid work in the cooperative yard, where he split and stacked under foremen half his age without complaint. Years later, when plank fronts gave way to brick on parts of the old street and new families arrived who had not seen the winter of 1887, the annex remained cut into the slope above the North Platte, its earth walls cool in July and steady in January. The inscription carved on the lintel is plain enough for any child to read. Heat is a duty before it is a trade. In Coldwater, the phrase "build it like Caldwell" entered ordinary speech, first as instruction, then as principle, and finally as memory held in practice rather than monument. The rope posts are renewed each autumn. The common yard still marks reserves by day count. The town still counts souls before storms. And when the first hard halo circles the moon, no one laughs at Greenwood anymore. The first autumn after the blizzard tested whether Coldwater had learned a lesson or merely survived a season. On September 14th, 1888, with dawn at 34 degrees and a dry west wind combing dust along the rebuilt street, Eli Boone unlocked the post office safe and laid Ezekiel Harrow's account books beside the trusty papers on a pine table scarred by years of telegraph keys and ink bottles. Two elected witnesses, Widow Ann Pike and Dr. Alvin Price, sat with him from sunup until the noon bell, adding columns, checking signatures, and matching ration entries against Boone's storm rosters from the annex door. Harrow stood through the whole audit with his hat in both hands and answered each question without defense. The numbers showed exactly what the town had suspected and feared. Emergency prices had been raised beyond freight risk. Sack weights had been cut when scales froze, and credit had been threatened as leverage. Boone wrote the finding in the town record in a hand clear enough to outlive argument, then closed the book and said the debt to trust would be repaid in labor, not in speeches. 3 days later, under a pale sky that promised early frost, Dustin set a measuring rod against the wall of the first new communal drying gallery on town ground above floodline. It was 12 feet in interior run, with 5 shelf tiers, 6 inches of airspace between slats, and a lower flue pitched to carry heat without pooling soot at the bend. Families watched while he demonstrated load order with split willow, then required each household to practice the sequence before taking home marked bundles. Harrow hauled stone in a wheelbarrow whose handles had once belonged to Nolan Pike. Each trip left dark sweat on his shirt despite the morning chill. Ruth Vale, now 13 and steady as Boone at a ledger desk, checked species tags and day count marks in chalk. At midday, Dustin held up 2 billets, struck them on stone, and made the circle listen for the difference between dull transit wood and ringing burn wood. No one mocked the exercise. No one looked away. By the second week of October, Caleb Rourke requested a private word at the rope post nearest the old church corner, where knots had been retied for the coming winter. He removed his gloves, then replaced them, then removed them again before he finally spoke. He said the excavation notice he had delivered in December had not been routine zeal, as he had implied in public, but a direct instruction from Harrow to unsettle Dustin and delay work before the first hard front. He said he had understood the intention and lacked the courage to refuse until too late. Dustin listened with his back to the wind, checked the post depth with his boot heel, and answered in the same plain register he used for vent settings. You brought the paper. You also wrote the boundary truth when you measured it. Keep choosing the second act. Caleb nodded once, took up the post maul, and reset 6 anchors before dusk without further conversation. When the first moon halo of the new season appeared on November 2nd, 1888, broad and pale above the ridge in a ring every trapper in the valley could read, Coldwater did not wait for panic. Church bells rang twice for drill call, not worship, and families moved by roster to the common yard with pails, gloves, and tally slates. The annex and the new galleries ran together as one system, intake crews clearing frost from tunnel mouths, stove crews maintaining low and steady draft, broth crews turning kettles at marked intervals, watch crews walking rope lines by knot count. Dr. Price checked elders and infants first, then signed each clearance card and handed it to Ruth for the wallboard. Harrow, assigned to transport grade bundles, delivered 32 loads from Shelf 4 to Riverbend cabins before midnight, each tied with twine dipped in tallow at the ignition end, exactly as Dustin had taught months earlier. The cold fell to -18 before dawn and held there through noon. No home in town lost fire. No family crossed the street unguided. On November 6th, after the drill had proven itself under real weather, the town gathered again in the church, though this time the benches were arranged in a square instead of facing a lectern, and that geometry altered the tone from accusation to shared duty. Ann Pike rose first and placed Nolan's Mall at the center, saying it would remain communal property for shelter builds and emergency crews, never sold, never claimed by one house. Next came Lila Morrow's brother, Thomas, who brought the attendance slates and the surviving copybooks recovered the day she died, now wrapped in oilcloth and tied with clean cord. He asked that they be stored in the annex chest as training tools for children, so her final errand would continue warming homes by instruction rather than by fire. Martha Elling's blue square quilt, repaired at the torn seam, was folded and set beside them for use on the cold bench where arrivals were first treated. One by one, physical remnants of the storm moved from private grief into shared practice, and each placement carried both memory and rule. Dustin spoke only after every item had been accounted for, and every offered confession had settled into silence. He stood beside the chest, rested one hand on the deer-hide ledger, and looked around the square at souls who had mocked him, buried with him, worked beside him, and learned from him. He said apology mattered because it named harm honestly, but it did not insulate walls or dry wood. He said the town had already begun the harder work, which was repetition without applause. He then opened the Caldwell ledger, stitched by Ira and maintained by Dustin, to the Christmas entries. Read the temperature line of -31 on the morning of December 25th. Read the vent notes and rotation marks exactly as written, and pass the open book clockwise so every household head could see that survival had been built one measured choice at a time. When the ledger returned to him, he placed it in the chest with Harrow's audited account summary, Boone's copied town manual, Lila's slates, and the roster board Ruth had kept during the storm. Keep records, he said. Memory fades under comfort. Ink does not. Winter of 1889 came hard, but not catastrophic, and Coldwater met it with systems that had moved from one annex to an entire settlement. Fuel quotas were posted by household size at the common yard gate each Monday morning. Chimney inspections were completed before November the 15th and signed by 2 witnesses. Rope posts were tested after every thaw-freeze cycle, and damaged lines were replaced the same day. Harrow remained on labor wages through that season, then through the next, never returning to trustee office and never reopening a private fuel monopoly. He became, by gradual proof, the strongest splitter on transport crews and the most reliable night watch on intake tunnels. Some souls forgave him openly, others did not speak his name outside assignments. The town functioned anyway. In July 1896, during a hot spell when the North Platte ran low and children played where drifts had once stood shoulder high, Ruth Vale, now a schoolteacher herself, led a class of 12 to the annex and held up 2 billets for a lesson in practical ethics. One billet rang, one did not. She asked the children what separated them. A boy answered moisture. A girl answered patience. Ruth said both were correct and added a third word, responsibility. She then pointed to the chest and read the labels aloud, one item at a time, so the new generation would know why each object remained in town custody and what duty it represented. Coldwater stands now larger than 318 souls, with brick fronts where plank once warped and new roofs where drift once crushed old beams. But the earth-walled annex still stands cut into the slope above the North Platte, cool in summer, steady in winter, and maintained each autumn by crews who still call their measurements Caldwell marks. The rope posts are reset every October. The common yard still grades fuel by day count. The church record still carries Boone's audit entry and Dustin's instruction lines in the same volume. Inside the annex chest, the deer-hide ledger remains legible. Harrow's corrected accounts remain attached to the audit sheet. Lila Morrow's slates remain wrapped and dry. Nolan Pike's maul hangs by the door for drills, and Marta Elling's blue quilt rests folded on the cold bench for first arrivals when weather turns sharp. Travelers who ask why Coldwater keeps such old objects receive one answer from whoever is nearest: because heat is a duty before it is a trade, and because a town that learns this in time does not need to learn it again through loss.